Ian Forrester calls himself a fire starter, but not the kind of fire starter popularized by Drew Barrymore in the 1984 movie. Ian works for the BBC's R&D Advisory Team. He focuses on open innovation and new disruptive opportunities, working with startups, early adopters, and hackers.
I spent a lot of time when I first started at the BBC in the World Service, which is a news outlet side of the BBC. And it was always a cycle where you go into work, you work on stuff, and I was in the development team. But when it came to 4 o'clock, there was a massive rush getting the stories out, getting them out to the right places. Is it done? Is the editor happy? All those stuff. And to be fair, I've worked at a newspaper as well, so I know that cycle. You don't have time to sit there and think about what does this mean in like 2, 3, 4, 5 years time. That's what R&D. So that's what R&D department does, and the advisory team focuses on some of the kind of core issues that are relevant to the future of broadcasting, but the future of the BBC and the future of, I would say, of all public entities when it comes to the internet.
Hey, welcome everybody to the latest episode of the Plutopia News Network podcast. I'm here with my partner Scoop Sweeney and our co-host Wendy Grossman. And our guest today is Ian Forrester, who is really a well-known character on the digital scene in the UK and Europe, and probably soon to be well-known in the United States as more and more people watch and listen to this podcast. Ian lives in Manchester in the UK, and he works for BBC's R&D Advisory Team. His specialty is open innovation and new disruptive opportunities. And by creating value with an open engagement and collaborations with startups, universities, hackers, and early adopters. And we're excited about that. We're excited to have you here, Ian.
Oh, thank
and
you.
Wendy's going to kind of launch the discussion here.
Yeah, I don't think Ian remembers how we met, actually, but I do, because it was 2008, and I was going to the Emerging Tech Conference in San Diego, and my friend Sue Charman said, you have to get on Twitter because you will be able to follow which sessions to go to at the conference and what's exciting there. And I said, but I don't know anybody. And she said, follow Cubic Garden. And I said, all right, follow Cubic Garden. And so Ian was the first person I ever followed on Twitter. And because it was
very sorry.
Days, he followed me back. and then a few years later, I think we met somehow in real life, but you didn't actually remember who I was.
We might have met before. I was at that conference.
All right. Well, there you go.
Yeah, San Diego. I remember it well.
Yeah. So
I just say I apologize for if I knew what a hellscape Twitter or X or everyone would call it now that would have gone, then I would have done something about it.
No, I really loved Twitter for a lot of years, until Elon Musk took it over. But let's not let him poison the discussion.
Good idea.
Now, one of the things I thought we should start with, actually, Ian, is talking about the BBC as a public service broadcaster, because, when you say public service broadcasting in the States, what people think of is PBS and NPR, and they are not anything like the BBC and its influence. I mean, I remember in the early days of the internet, the BBC had its own dial-up ISP that you could pay to join. And, and in the early days of computing, it commissioned the BBC Acorn in order to teach, so that they could have a bunch of programs and somebody could buy a computer and they could actually learn about computing. And, this mission to educate the public is really, it's a whole different class for the BBC than it is for a lot of other countries. So, tell us a little bit about what it's like sort of being part of all that.
Yeah, so I have to be very clear that this is my opinions rather than the BBC. I always have to say that. But no, I think it's interesting because, the history of, particularly around the BBC Micro, is a really interesting one. So at the time, there's this new thing called microchips, and it became very clear that the kind of government of the UK, they kind of saw that there was something about this. Obviously, people at the BBC saw that it was kind of this new thing might be quite big, and so in the idea of public service, it became very clear that what what we really needed to do was to help people to understand the kind of power of the microchip, but also that doesn't mean just putting computers in people's hands, which is done via Acorn and a few other companies, but also there's the education of that. The BBC ran a series of kind of I guess kind of like videos or about how to actually use this piece of this hardware, what you could do with it, stuff like that. And we actually published a series of magazines that you could also buy in newspaper in newsagents. So it wasn't just I kind of want to make this very clear. It's not just like we helped with the getting the computer in people's hands. And the other thing I was going to say about what in your introduction to the micro was that it also was pushed towards education, and that's a really important part. So my experience of using a BBC Micro first time was in school, and so you kind of grow up learning at this thing, and you get to look at the tutorials online, not online, sorry, on the TV, and kind of following on online.
I was going to say you're rewriting history a bit there.
Yeah, that's a very different history. But yeah, I think there's that notion, that foresight of this could be important, and rather than it be just given to the people who can afford this, how can we make this available to everyone? Is a really important thing that the BBC did, and I'd like to see much more of that. And I think we have seen some of that again and again. So for example, the follow-on from the BBC Micro, many years later, I'll say decades later, is the micro bit, for example. That's another example of something that we made it very cheap. We worked with external companies, including Microsoft, funny enough, and then we kind of gave it away to school children, but with tutorials, with online videos, all of this kind of stuff. So it wasn't just, here's a piece of hardware, go away and do something with it. So some people would love that, but some people just need something to inspire them, or something that they can just follow just to kind of get into it. And I think that's what the BBC is very good at.
I think even just as recently as 10, 15 years ago, I was writing for a thing called Webwise, which is a section of the BBC website that is very basic tutorials on how to do things online.
Yeah.
Again, you wouldn't see NPR doing something like that.
I wonder, I know a little bit about NPR and PBS. I'm wondering, I don't want to get political, but it could be some of the funding around public organizations like PBS and NPR could be some of the things that are quite difficult. Where obviously the BBC, sorry, for people who are watching and listening, the BBC is funded by a license fee. So if the idea is if you have a TV in your house, in your household, then you have to pay a TV license. Now that has changed quite a bit with digital technology. So if you have a monitor, that's not a TV because it needs to have a TV tuner. And then obviously people are streaming stuff. So there's a whole influx of things that have changed. But because of that funding and the willingness for, I guess, the public to fund that gives them a lot more ability to do some of the things that I think NPR and PBS may have wanted to do, but maybe couldn't.
It also gives the BBC a much bigger responsibility too. I mean, if the entire population is funding something, then you want to provide value for the maximum number of people as possible.
Yeah, no,
I do think it's a very different model,
I
and
think
I
you're
don't,
absolutely right.
you so you John read out the section of the BBC that you work for. I didn't realize it was quite so specific. When it says advisory, does that mean you get to get people to listen to you, or do you have to sell it every time?
I, I think it's a bit of both. I don't think it's. I mean, there are people who we don't. So one of the things we do in advisory is we don't just kind of go around looking for stuff. Obviously parts of the BBC come to us and say. So say for example, one of my things that I'm very focused on right now is the future of social. So you only have to look about 2-3 years ago. You know, Twitter was kind of like a thing, and people were already kind of debating kind of the death of Twitter, and then it got bought by we won't mention his name,
He who shall
and
not be named.
yes, I like that. I'm going to use that from now on. But it's not only that the way that social media in particular, and I'll just be clear, I'm talking about the future of social, so not just social media. Social media is a bit that people most recognize, but it's more than that. But we started to recognize that for a lot of people, that was kind of their kind of that's their connection with the internet, and that's the connection with their friends as well. They're doing it through social media, and so it became very clear what role does a public service broadcaster or public service company have in that kind of space? Is it just as I personally would say, we just broadcast to people, telling people about what we're doing, the latest shows, some of the news, stuff like that, or is there more that we could be doing? And I think that's that. If you are focused on looking, maybe 6 months ahead, and you're being bombarded by lots of these other organizations that are saying this is the future, AI is the future. Yeah, they can go there if you want to, but they don't have time to sit back and think and look, because it's a constant kind of like pushing stuff out. I spent a lot of time when I first started the BBC in the World Service, which is a news outlet side of the BBC, and it was always a cycle where you go into work, you work on stuff, and I was in the development team. But when it came to 4 o'clock, there was a massive rush getting the stories out, getting them out to the right places. Is it done? Is the editor happy? All those stuff. And to be fair, I've worked on a newspaper as well, so I know that cycle. You don't have time to sit there and think about what does this mean in like 2, 3, 4, 5 years time. That's what R&D. So that's what R&D department does, and the advisory team focuses on some of the kind of core issues that are relevant to the future of broadcasting, but the future of the BBC and future of, I would say, of all public entities when it comes to the internet. How's that sound?
Well, you said something earlier about social being more than social media, or social internet being more than social media. What else are you thinking about?
Oh, it's funny because I did an interview with Wendy actually, so I feel like I should pass it to Wendy. But I think that if you think about social media right now, it's very much like you're engaging with a thing, and that thing is we're going to call let's say a piece of media, right? And with social networks, remember social networks? We all remember social network. You're engaging with people. And yes, in social media, you do engage with people, but it's usually because they're posting something and you're engaging that way. And so the relationship's slightly different. That's why you get this kind of parasocial kind of relationship where lots of people are following one person because they feel posting regular, interesting things. Where with a social network, you generally would follow people that you know or people that you find very interesting for different reasons, rather than just following not following this one person because they're consistently posting, I don't know, about their amazing rides in first class to Japan. I don't know,
So it's sort of the difference. So you're sort of talking about the difference between somebody joining Twitter so they can follow Stephen Fry, who is the most popular Twitter, well, used to be the most popular Twitter personality, versus somebody who joins Facebook to join in order to join the group that their street uses to communicate about issues in the street, or WhatsApp, for example. A lot of streets have WhatsApp groups.
yes,
And that would be the difference between a social media and social network, right?
yes.
Well, there's also the thing of when you're engaging online. Early on, when we were first on Twitter, and now a lot of people are having this experience on Mastodon, you kind of knew who you were talking to. You saw the people that you followed. But the evolution of social media has been to kind of move in a broadcast direction where they're putting stuff in your feed that you didn't really ask to see. And you're seeing less and less of it's less conversational. You're less connected to people that you know. Plus, you have the infiltration of spaces like Twitter by bots. So you don't even know if you're talking to a human being right now. So I think that really complicates things. And the question for me has been, how do we get back to a more human use of the internet versus
First, we have to
this
clean
kind
up
of
the AI.
manipulative environment? Huh?
First, we have to
Oh,
clean
yeah.
up the AI. But what that's saying to me is that Twitter and Facebook and some of these others are behaving more like traditional broadcasters, where they want to take control of the output. And it's interesting to me because the BBC, your section of the BBC, seems to me to be trying to do the opposite, which is make a broadcaster into something that is not broadcasting.
Yeah, I mean, my personal view is that I've never been. So my history has always been around kind of design, um, development, kind of the internet, kind of that kind of thing. I actually, I've said it before many times, but I was never actually a fan of the BBC. It wasn't until I realised the importance of public service. That's when it really that's the moment when I realized how important this was, and I also realized, when I was growing up, I was from a working class family, and we couldn't afford, you know, computers. My first experience with a computer was in school, and I loved them. I loved what the possibilities that they provided. But I also realized that it was very easy to kind of follow the route of just doing what everyone else does, or I wanted to always learn how they worked and understand, what they could be used for beyond just playing games, for example. So I think that kind of curiosity was always there. And I always think about myself, it's not trying to be, I don't model this stuff on myself, but I think it's interesting. I think about all of these kind of kids and young people who are kind of in situations where they've got access to a phone potentially, and all they're doing right now is just on social media, where actually there's a lot more you could do with the phone. You could. There are ways, and there's multiple ways. There are kits where you could learn to write Python on your phone. There are ways to write other things. I know that's not
I was thinking of the physical act of typing and how painful it would be, and how hard it would be to debug every single thing and make sure you didn't have a semicolon instead of a colon and all the rest of it. I was just thinking how painful that would be on a phone. It wasn't that I think it's a bad idea to program on your phone.
That's a good use of AI.
People were programming on the the old Scions, and they weren't,
Yes.
But that's the thing where I always get so frustrated when people talk about digital natives as though kids are digital natives. Kids aren't digital natives. Today's kids are phone natives, and what they know how to do is use a search engine, or ask a question on some social media, or FaceTime their friends.
Tap with thumbs.
Yeah. I mean, that actually is true. I was at a small conference last year, and I said in passing over dinner that, I didn't want to bother answering email on my phone. I wanted to go back and use a real keyboard, which was so much easier. And the younger people laughed at me. They couldn't believe that a laptop keyboard would be easier to type on than a phone keyboard. I'm just going, oh my God, these people have worms in the brain.
Unfortunately, I'm in that same camp. I mean, so my girlfriend's a bit younger, and she was booking flights on her phone. I was like, why would you do that? Like, I mean, even the practicalities of being able to compare over multiple tabs. I'm like, what?
I have 3 monitors on my desk. A phone seems really, really small. Even a big phone.
Yes.
Like this one.
Yeah.
But I think that the phone keyboards are made to be thumbed. I find that I have fewer typos when I use my thumbs, but I also find it very hard to use my thumbs. It's like the phone wants to fall out of my hands. It's an interesting thing. I'd like to get a handle on it.
I guess what I'm really getting at is that there's a new generation of people, and not even, and you make the really good point, Wendy, about it's not even young people, it's people who are moving into the space, for whatever reason. And right now the focus is on this device. I'm holding up a phone for anyone, is purely for social media, so potentially, social media and messaging.
And banking. A lot of people, a surprising number of people do banking and financial services on their phones. And the reason it surprises me,
Venmo.
The reason it surprises me is just that it's so obvious to me that it's really easy to lose your phone or have it stolen, and then your banking device is gone. So my idea of if I have to use a mobile app for banking, I have a separate device that stays home, that does not have anything on it other than like the banking apps, and it lives in a drawer.
That's quite extreme.
I know it's extreme, but I don't actually want to have that at all. I want to do banking on the web, where you have more screen space, and but yeah, well, I just
think.
No, go
sorry.
on.
Well, I was going to say, I think my thing is that right now, if we leave things as they are, the commercial companies will always focus on the things that entertain people, and they can get data from, and they can collect, they can follow you, surveil you, all of these things. And so the reason why I think not just myself, but other people are talking about the BBC and other public service broadcasters or public entities as being good places to focus on beyond broadcasting, is that because if we leave it as it is, it's just not good. I can't see it going well. I can see very bad things happening if they're not already bad things that are already happening. There is the things like the micro, the Webwise, all these things, like an organization that actually is trying to help you to to explore the world, to actually understand yourself. Those kind of values are not, they're just not of interest to some of the commercial companies. So I feel like it's important that somebody, and one of the things I was thinking about is that you have the commercial entities that will do a tiny bit of this, but their focus is still on paying the shareholders. And then you've got the government, which will do what the government does, and then you need something else. And that's where I think the public entities or public interest companies come in. Because I'm also very aware that I'm never quite sure what it's like when it comes to libraries in America, but there's these other entities which are not the government, and they're not commercial. There's this middle ground, and they're kind of probably, if they actually really put their heads towards it, they probably could be a kind of a nice middle ground for this stuff.
It's encouraging that BBC is doing things other than direct broadcasting. I worked in public broadcasting in the 1960s, 1970s, and it was partially subscriber funded, and we got a Corporation for Public Broadcasting funding sometimes, depending on who was in charge of the government. If it was a conservative government, we were poor. If it was a progressive government, we did better. And I found that disturbing, and it's still that way, because you can look at broadcasting, and during the Trump years, it was very slim support from the government. And I would imagine that might, be influenced somewhat in the BBC. Has that been your experience?
I have to caveat a lot of the things I say because I kind of moved from world service into a space which is more research development, and I actually got absorbed into research development. So I think my experience has been quite different from a lot of people. I think a lot of people still go to the BBC or want to join the BBC because they want to be a camera person, or they want to be behind the scenes doing whatever, or working on, I don't know, say in Europe right now, in the UK, the Euros, the football Euros is sorry, football as in soccer, sorry, is kind of quite a big thing, and so people are very excited by that. I'm very conscious that I've never really been interested in that stuff. I'm interested in the bigger picture. I'm interested in fundamental changes to society. The nice thing is, obviously, when you get into these positions, you find the others. You find the others who are also wanting to do this. And sometimes you get quite lucky. There's quite a few people who are further up the food chain who agree with you. And there are other people who disagree or don't see the world how you see it. It's not necessarily just a political thing. They see that the BBC could be, a very good company for an alternative to some of the streaming services, or a streaming service in itself, which I think is not what I would go for, but other people do. So I think I would say that I find that most of the people I speak to do see that there's an importance to us being more than just a broadcaster, and this is the natural path for a public entity. And I say that also with my experience of talking to other public organizations, and especially public broadcasters in Europe. I work with Wiley, which is the Finnish broadcaster. the there's a whole bunch, but the one I was thinking about in particular is this one called NRK, which is the Norwegian broadcaster, and they made a decision just recently to remove themselves from social media. And that's a quite a brave thing to do. They had a massive backlash because people cannot believe that the broadcaster, the national broadcaster, would remove themselves from social media, but they see it. I mean, I'm using words that I would use rather than them. Is that it's just the medium is the message. If the medium is full of a lot of stuff that doesn't represent what you're about, then does it make sense to be there? But there's also that kind of that pull and from other people, even within the BBC, are saying, well, that's where the audience is, and that's where we need to be. We need to be relevant to the audience. Well, me personally feels like that's a great argument, but there's a point where we need to make a decision that actually it's great the audience is there, but we either not trying to encourage them to other platforms like the Fediverse or elsewhere that are more neutral or more healthy, more healthy for not in just like the media you consume, but in the ownership of your data. Then what are we doing? We just become another broadcaster like everyone else. I think that answers
it's a
your
more
question.
cooperative model on the Fediverse. But I'm wondering, so if they remove themselves from social media, does that mean that they remove themselves from digital interaction? Do they have spaces in mind other than social media that they can use to interact with their audience?
Yes. So what they've done, so what NRK have done, and we're talking to them quite a lot about it, is they've obviously retreated back to their own domain. And we know in the BBC, we've done this before, and we know that trying to get people to come to us is very problematic. People will come, that's great, but there's now, for me in particular, and this is what they work with the Future of Social, there's this kind of third space now where we don't have to drag them over to our domain. We can have, in the same way as you scroll through Instagram, we could run a pixel fed, which is like Instagram, for anyone that's not sure, but it's a federated model. We could run our own, and we could have some policies over that. So it's almost like our walls have extended outwards, and this is what we're saying to NRK: is that if you kind of follow this route where you're not dragging people all the way back, you're able to like meet them where they are on their phones or on their laptops, like me and Wendy. But rather than you have to come to this domain, you can extend that outwards, and you can be part of. You can still be in a space where people are able to talk to other people, but you're also there as well. I think that's probably more. This is what I keep on thinking, that's some of the research is linking me that way to think this is probably the future of social when it comes to the especially for public service broadcasting.
Well, this is like the BBC has its own Mastodon instance, for example. So the difference it makes is that anything that comes from that, anything posted by anyone using an ID on that instance in that server, that it's automatically authenticated as coming from somebody at the BBC, and the BBC has ownership of the server. The BBC can say, we don't want this on our server and don't post this again, or it gives you. I don't think the BBC would necessarily want to censor the people commenting, but you have much better control than you do on a system that's owned by someone else, where all of a sudden there are all these bots and they're, posting all this nonsense. You're basically, you own your own community. And I've said for years that that's what people need to do, that as soon as you have someone else who owns your community, even if the service is not free, but certainly if the service is free, you are dependent on them and the goodwill of their business model, which may change. And you look at like the number of products that Google, for example, has canceled. And, why would you depend on them for anything?
They just canceled Google Podcasts.
Really? I didn't know
Yeah,
there was Google Podcasts.
I know it's cancelled in America, and it's now cancelled in the rest of the world. So, but you can still download the app, which is, anyway, that's a whole different thing. But no, I think you're absolutely right, and this is the opportunity now. Is that when we launched our own Mastodon instance, we have rules about what's posted on there. We currently only, this is our decision right now, is that we currently only have BBC accounts on there. So when you're subscribing, rather than subscribe to, bbc.birdsite.xyz, and you're thinking, oh, this news doesn't look quite right. You can actually follow BBC, you can follow, let's say, BBC R&D BBC R&D at social BBC, and that is definitely R&D. That's not like some bot pretending to be, and so you can follow it back and go, oh, it's the verified account. It's verified because it's verified on the BBC domain. It's not just some verified account on another instance, because we already know what, the whole Twitter verification thing, or the X verification thing, is just like, that speaks volumes about verification. It's just
Yeah.
it's not right. It's not. It doesn't
For
make sense.
people who haven't followed it, it used to be that only Twitter would verify people. For example, if you were Stephen Fry, they would make sure that the account that said it was Stephen Fry was actually Stephen Fry, and it would put a little blue tick mark to indicate that it was an authentic account. And now Elon Musk has got, I said his name, has gotten rid of all that, and instead you can pay to have a blue tick next to your name. And of course, so now it is absolutely meaningless, other than somebody was willing to pay what is now known as X to have a blue tick next to their name. But it doesn't actually tell you anything about the authenticity of the account. And in fact, since most people are really annoyed by this whole thing, if there's a blue tick, you can pretty much guarantee that it's some kind of fake account, and you can ignore it. And yeah, I mean, it's very depressing.
It is, but this is the thing. I think part of what we do is, rather than focus on the negative, we think about the alternatives and how those alternatives can actually be viable. Because that's the thing, that when you're in a newsroom and you're putting news out every single day, you haven't got the time to sit there and think about, right, okay, so, so for example, I wrote RSS for the for BBC World Service a long time ago. I had a bit more time.
You might want to explain what RSS is.
Oh, sorry. RSS is real simple syndication, which allows you. So back in the day, you used to be able to subscribe to a site, and you'd get the textual information in your newsreader. It also can. You could, so for example, you had like Yahoo, my Yahoo. You could subscribe to it, and you could get the headlines on your front page.
Actually, in a lot of places, you can still do this. And the place you most often see it, especially, is in podcasts. Almost every podcast page a lot of them do support RSS, and you can get the list of episodes and stuff, and not not mess around with having to have a special app or anything. You can just
I
play it
was
using
I was
audio
I was
player.
going to say, you've opened up a whole another topic of mine
Yeah, I
about.
think I think we should I think we should not allow ourselves to stray too far into the wonders.
Okay, yeah, no. So but yeah, so the idea ultimately is that when knowing enough about RSS and understanding the power of it and what it meant for the organization and what it meant for the public to be able to read this stuff no matter where is quite powerful. So, for example, one of the things that happened when I was at the World Service is that the World Service is blocked in China. Well, all BBC News is blocked in China for reasons that you can imagine. And so there's also another country, Iran, that also blocked us. I think I'm not sure they're still blocking or not, but one of the things about RSS is that people were subscribing to the BBC World Service RSS in my Yahoo or in another RSS reader. The RSS reader pulls down the feed or the RSS, and then the person could view it in my Yahoo or whatever reader that they're reading it in. Now, what usually happens is that the country won't block something like Yahoo or won't block kind of where a feed reader is. They're blocking the BBC. So people were able to read of what the BBC was doing and what the BBC's thoughts are about different things, the thoughts about news, but without actually going to the BBC. So it's this kind of power that it's that power to the to give to the people is quite powerful. And it's I remember in some of the discussions about RSS, should we be doing this? Should we not be doing this? We want people to come back to our homepage. It's like, well, that doesn't make sense. That's not the way that the world's going to be. And obviously, kind of right.
Yeah, this is kind of this is kind of where I came in. I was not terribly interested in politics in general outside of reproductive rights, really. And I thought that was settled. I mean, I was 16 when they legalized abortion in New York, and I thought that was it. I had not yet heard. There's a guy who used to work for the ACLU named Barry Steinhardt, who apparently his saying is, no civil liberty fight ever remains won. And so there you go. But anyway, somewhere around 90 or 91, someone said to me that I should read Robert McChesney's work. And McChesney wrote a lot about the early days of radio and television. And I read agog that the early days of radio were very much like the early days of the internet. All the stations were owned by universities and educational establishments and government agencies. And, gradually it became taken over as a commercial medium, particularly in the States, obviously, and turned into the medium we know today. And so I read all that and sort of thought about the history of television going the same way and thought, well, we don't want the internet to do that. And that's where I came into being interested in in the politics around the internet. And this is still very much what we're talking about now. I think you had me come talk in Salford in 2013 about, it was after the Snowden revelations. And I had written this piece, Take Back the Net, about trying to re-decentralize the net. And that was 11 years ago. And it's, if anything, more centralized now. But that has been all along kind of my thought, was how do we keep the internet from turning into just a commercial broadcast medium? And that's what you're working on.
Yeah, I think
one thing I'd like to hear us talk about, if you're aware of it, is indie web or independent web, which is actually a movement to try to take back the internet. Are you aware of that, Ian?
Oh, I'm aware of the indie web. Yes, I've been to some of their indie camps. Actually, last I went to was in Berlin. I know quite a few of those people. It's actually funny you mentioned that. So in 2019, I went to the indie web camp in Berlin right before I went to Republica, which is a quite big conference, which I also went to this year. they were showing about Tantek Shelek, I think they've got his name right, showed this diagram where he was talking about how you'd be able to almost like read stuff in via a protocol, which I can't remember the name of the protocol now, but it was the forerunner to what's the my mind's blanking now, but it was a protocol that they're working on, and then there was a way of also when you read it, you could post something and it would send a thing back to the other side. And I remember coming back to the BBC and going, "Look at this! This is powerful. This is really powerful. This does away with the need to rely on these centralized servers. This is just sending one to another. Web mentions, thank you very much." And I remember literally, I've got that presentation because I just did a presentation about Republica 2024, and I went back for that presentation, and I was like, "Oh my goodness, like it's happened. It's actually happened." And so this is why I know you mentioned you kind of read my bio. I need to get a better bio. I'm not very good at writing bios, but I do like working with kind of hackers, early adopters, because I class myself as an early adopter as well. We get to try these things and experiment with these things, and like the pain that I'm experiencing right now, sitting on a Ubuntu machine, which I don't think is an early adopter, but for most people it will be, trying to get GitHub working and all these things. It's a real pain. It is a real pain. But through people like us, we get to kind of realize the solution, by narrowing down, this is the core of what we're trying to do. I'm not saying we're the only people, but I feel like those communities don't really get the credit that they deserve, because they're either way too early, or they're the ones that are moving the needle. Their values are always consistent. Decentralization, autonomy, all of these things are always consistent. And if the technology doesn't match that, then they make it match that. And I think we need more people like that, or we need more people to take notice. And obviously, I'm sure the indie web and others would love to say this, to fund some of these people. So also, some of the people I work with they don't seem like a early adopter, but there are quite a few early adopters in them. But I work with Mozilla, which for anyone that doesn't know, who make Firefox. There's a load of other organizations, even like some of I've never got a chance to go to the Chaos Computer Club, which are literally a bunch of hackers in Germany. But there's also a thing called FOSDEM. There's all of these smaller communities that their values are very aligned with what a public service organization or the public interest is about. And I think that they should be. I mean, I've got a map of different collaborators that I would love to be able to work with, and they're on there, So it's important, and these people are important, and what they do is important. And in like 5 years' time, the stuff that they're doing now is the kind of stuff that will be kind of going, "Oh yeah, this stuff is great."
Well, this is like the history of open source software too, which is that it began with an idea in a small group of people, and it has slowly. I mean, you're talking about an Ubuntu desktop, and I have one too, and it's not really that common on the desktop, but it underlies Android, which is 70% of smartphones, and it powers most of the world's web servers. So there's a lot of power in that.
Absolutely.
And yet it's the sort of thing that makes governments uneasy, because they like large companies that are sort of the same size they are, that they can do deals with.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a shame that it has to be that way. And I think, I know for a fact that there's things that we've done in the past in the BBC. So, for example, the very first version of iPlayer. So, iPlayer is I'm not sure how to best describe it. It's our streaming video solution.
It's your streaming media app.
Yes.
And I don't think most people outside it's just to a large extent it's geo fenced, so that
Yeah.
if you're not in the UK, the presumption is that you're not a license fee payer, and therefore you don't really have access to it. But you can go and you can look up, like, if there's a series that you come in the middle and you want to see the early episodes, you'll find them on iPlayer. You'll find BBC radio programs on iPlayer. Just yesterday, I read a review in The Guardian about a new podcast series in which the actor Michael Sheen is investigating the persistence of the poisoning of the land near where he lives with forever chemicals. And they've already played some of this, and you can go and get the whole series through iPlayer. So it's that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I guess for most people, it's kind of like what you see with like Netflix and all the others. This was done a long time ago. I think we're talking about, geez, I think it was 2009.
It's been there a long time.
Yeah, it's been around for a long time. A lot of the other apps that have been built since are kind of based around the similar thing. But the reason why I bring it up is because there was a real scare in the UK that the BBC was going to take down the internet in the UK because streaming video on an ADSL connection or a 56K modem, it's just like the ISPs our actual news articles
I remember that period when it used to be said that a new app would kill the internet, with some regularity, and the web almost broke the internet, and then yes, video was definitely going to kill the internet.
So the internet.
Instead, they built more internet.
Yes. So one of the things that BBC did was actually we made it so it's peer-to-peer. And this is kind of, I mean, like, if you even saying it now, I bet most people couldn't even believe it. So what I mean by peer-to-peer is probably one of the better applications of that would be if you're a bit older, like us, then you might remember Napster. You might remember, if you're a bit younger, you might remember stuff like BitTorrent. This. But the whole idea is that you are not getting it from one centralized server. You're getting it from other people that are also watching the same thing.
Basically, it's an app that if you start downloading a file, you download a bit of it and someone else downloads a bit of it, and you swap the bits with each other. You don't necessarily have to go back to a canonical. Now, that's kind of the opposite of Netflix, because what Netflix does is it plays each person their own individual copy, which is much more wasteful of internet resources, which is why peer-to-peer is a really good thing.
But even then, I mean, like this, you got to imagine this technology from like the Napster age and all of these other kind of things was seen as kind of like, why would an organization like the BBC even entertain that? Even though, as Wendy points out, it's so much more efficient than getting it from the centralized server. Now, that kind of stuff was being used by the kind of people that we're just mentioning. This is not that. For them, it was like, yeah, this makes sense. Now, obviously, the BBC chose to move away from that, probably because of like the rights holders, kind of all types of other reasons. But to even attempt that was an important move, because just trying it and launching it in quite very high profile application was quite an important move. at some point we moved to Silverlight, which is a whole different thing I don't want to talk about. But I think the notion of looking and seeing what the smaller communities are doing and learning from them, and then kind of translating that into something which actually could benefit the public, is the kind of thing that I think is really important, and the kind of thing that I do for R&D. Yeah, I think we're not even aware that's a real problem. We need to be more aware of these new things that are coming along and how it would work, for us, because particularly they tend to share very similar values to what we have, and so just because they're small, they're probably nimble and they're able to spin things up much quicker and to try things out, and we should be working with them, rather than working against them. That's my thoughts.
Over the years, our podcast has interviewed people with the Indie Web and various other independent projects, and one of the problems is always funding. I mean, if you're an independent and you're trying to compete with Google and Apple and all of the other bigs, you're out. You're out of your league basically, and it's very hard to get a successful outcome on these things. One of the things that happens, if you are successful, they're going to buy you up and take it over, and it becomes part of their empire. How do you see independent projects, media, being able to overcome that problem of not being able to compete with the big boys?
Yeah, I see this all the time. So I'm aware that there are different statuses of organizations. So if you were to buy it, you couldn't buy it wholesale. You could only be a part of it. I'm aware of those kind of different things, but the wider point of funding is a really important one. I think this is where stuff like I remember I feel like I'm older if I'm not older. I'm like but I feel like I remember when GPL 3 came out, and there was a massive kind of discussion about why would a company ever support anything that supported GPL3, because then
let's just tell people that the GPL is the general public license, and it's a way of using copyright to prevent people from controlling how something is used.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, I kind of go too far down the line. So I think that, like, for a company to buy someone like the Indie Web, who are or buys what they're doing, and then kind of basically own it and subvert it in a way that makes sense, is always a risk. But I think there's ways to make that much more difficult. I think one of the problems also is that you always get organizations that they would like to be well funded. Everyone would like to kind of have to be not to worry about where the next set of money is coming from, to be able to research on this stuff for free, not for free, for like, and not have to worry about the cost of it or go for grants and stuff like that, is a dream. But there's also, I noticed, so for example, there used to be a lot of public R&D departments. And so, for example, myself, in R&D, we've released quite a lot of things open source. Now, to be fair, we've released it under an Apache 2 license, which is, what's the best way of describing Apache 2? I guess it's kind of
it's web server software, isn't it?
No, the actual license.
Well, the actual license, I don't know.
It's free to use as you like. You can use it for commercial usage, but you have to attribute us. So it's a kind of clear lineage of where that came from and where the research came from and stuff like that. I would love to see more of these organizations working with people like us, organizations like us, who have got similar values. I also am aware that a lot of the R&D departments in public service broadcasters in particular, especially in Europe, have basically gone because they just can't afford them. And people don't really like to pay for things that may or may not happen. But I feel like there's something where if we can get the right values and those values stay, and people are not interested in just selling to Google or selling to, I feel like there's something where the frameworks can help, releasing the stuff under quite strongly public open source or under licenses which are more restrictive if you are trying to do what the big entities are doing. I think that there's all these things can be done. It's hard. I've never worked in a kind of non-profit, so I don't know exactly the kind of the pain, but I can imagine, that people really want to be able to, especially when you've got to feel about healthcare and you've got to feel about, where you're going to get the next lot of food from to feed your family, then the pressure to just sell out is kind of very strong. It's hard.
I never had the sense that the people who have built things on the internet with the participation of the community around them and then sold it out from under them, I've never had the impression that those were people who were actually hungry.
Okay. No, I
if you think about
I agree.
Some of them, but I think the thing about the clash of values is very real. And this story is not quite, it's kind of sort of adjacent to what you're talking about, which is, it's a copyright story. I was at a meeting of the digital video broadcasting people, the people who set standards for DVDs and streaming and all sorts of things. And this guy sat down. I sat down with a couple of people I didn't know, which is a standard thing. And a guy I knew very slightly who happened to work for Disney came and sat himself down and said, and I said, these are two guys, they work for the Flemish public broadcaster, this is so-and-so who works for Disney. And he looked at them and he said, don't you just hate it when people copy your content and give it away for free? And they just laughed at him. They said, we're Flemish. We have a tiny, tiny audience. We are grateful if anybody wants to see our stuff.
Yeah, I know that talking to a lot of the public service broadcasters in Europe, they also kind of like, well, the only people who are going to be interested in this is people who actually speak this language, and that's usually that's a much smaller proportion compared to
John, was there something?
So we have reached the end of our hour. Can you believe we've been talking for an hour?
It's gone quick.
So thanks so much,
sure
Ian, for joining us.
More hours with Ian. That was very interesting. A lot of stuff that you were telling us about, and I'm sure there's more.
Yeah,
man, we'd love for you to join us again.
I was going to hold up the human values cards and talk about that in relation to the last topic, but I will leave it for another day.
We'll do it again soon. How about that?
That sounds fine to me. I'd love to be on again.
Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks for joining us.
You can stay in touch with Plutopia at plutopia.io. On Facebook, look for @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.